Bienvenido a un nuevo evento de Cátedra Europa.
Good morning. On behalf of the 24th edition of Cátedra Europa, we welcome you to the panel Global Television, a UK Perspective, for which we have the special participation of Dr. Janet Maccabi from University of London. We will now leave you with Professor Juan Pablo Osman. Welcome.
Hello, Anthony. Thank you. Thank you all for your attendance to this event. And let me introduce Janet McCabe. So she's going to be with us today. Janet works at the Birkbeck University of London. There she's a reader in television and film studies, assistant dean for postgraduate at the School of Arts, and co-program director of the Master of Arts in Film Programming and Curating. She's also she's with us. She's PhD, and she's also managing editor of the journal Critical Studies in Television. So thank you very much, Janet, for accepting our invitation. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So Janet has been researching global TV, or what she calls transnational TV studies, and one of the subjects of her research has been Betty la Fea, which, as we all know, it's what, and I can see the book back there of Betty. Hello, Betty. How are you? So we know Betty is one of our most important cultural products, and Janet has been researching Betty and all the repercussions of this cultural product in terms of transnational TV, or what we call also global TV. And as you know, Janet, there has been a huge debate here recently due to an article written by the feminist activist Florence Thomas, and then the main actor of Betty, Jorge Enrique Abello, replied to that article. And this whole situation created a whole controversy and national debate, which is quite interesting. And I think we're gonna get into that a little bit later. But yeah, we can start just like creating a perspective of how you see global TV, or what you call transnational TV. And I love the fact that, yeah, of course, this is in the UK British framework, of course, but I love the fact that you're also building up what you call an European point of view, and that's not going to be those are not going to be sweet words for Boris Johnson, but yeah, the UK is Europe, and I love that approach and that point of view. So by Brexit, so yeah, we can start creating kind of a context of how you see global TV and transnational TV. We can share some slides here if you want. Yeah, that you prepared for us. Okay. So here we go. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for that very generous introduction. And I really would like to start by extending my thanks to Juan Pablo for inviting me to speak and to talk about this issue of global television. In this session, and hopefully I won't bore you too much, but I'd like to sort of speak for a little while. I'd like to situate my response within a European rather than UK perspective. And in many ways, this is a political decision, and I think there's a political urgency here. But I think it's also very important to situate discussions of the global within European trends of thinking. In part, this is also in recognition of how the debate in Europe is profoundly shaped by issues of translation, transculturation, and transnationalism. So for me, global TV is a debate about border crossing, and the scholarship as such is formed in that very process. Adding to the debate further, my intervention as a transnational feminist TV cultural theorist is someone interested in theorizing transnational television culture and its representational geopolitics of being female in the world today. So I'm add also that as the managing editor of critical studies in television, and the reason why I know Juan Pablo as well, is that the journal from its very inception in 2006 was keen to publish scholarship on transnational media flows and really how best to understand how those flows could be studied as well as translated. And indeed, this concept of transnationalism, where the global encounters the local and vice versa, was the topic of our very first conference back in September 2006. And so in many ways, that little ramble through my history is also in recognition of my point of entry into the global TV debate and how this was actually through Yosobete Le Fay, or Ugly Betty, as the Yosobete text emerged as one of the key texts under discussion at the 2006 conference, more of which later. So in that sort of preface framing my contribution, I really welcome this exchange with Juan Pablo. How we've decided to undertake this exchange is and this kind of cross-border interchange, I think, is central to the very practice of global television. I want to use it then as a way to kind of steer a kind of way through and to offer a response of sorts to Florence Thomas and her polemic on Yosobete Le Fay and her weariness at the continued worldwide interest in the show. Now, while I accept her irritation at those stereotypes still in circulation, those stereotypes living in syndication through the Netflix reruns, I think her polemic raises some very important questions here, questions about time and the temporal and temporality. And what I mean here is the questions around the time it takes for television content to circulate in the world as IP agreements or intellectual property, that's what IP means, or territorial rights are secured and syndication rights negotiated. I also want to sort of point in the direction of this issue around time, because I think this is also another issue which is bound up in Florence Thomas' response. It's also about reputation and how reputations are formed in retrospect and over time, and how in that time the debates shift. Debates in feminism have certainly shifted, but also production values shift and they change, and what we value changes. So what once may look very progressive now can look quite derivative. But I shall leave that for further discussion later. I think it's also important to say that Yosobete Le Fay was one of the sort of textual discoveries at the 2006 CST conference, long after the original had ceased transmission in Colombia and Latin America in around 2001. But before Ugly Betty, the US show had premiered on ABC, and our conference was at the beginning of September, and Ugly Betty premiered on the 28th of September 2006. So what had sort of long been over in Latin America was something very new to us Europeans. And this was grounded further in that Yosobete Le Fay was remediated through Ugly Betty, as the original never aired in the UK, for example. So, can you go back? Sorry, can you just go back? Just to, that's lovely, thank you. So that as the original never aired, our experience of Yosobete Le Fay was always through this remediated version. I think the other issue that Thomas's polemic raises is questions around culture and politics, about different theoretical eyes, and goes to the very heart of the issue of translation. For what Thomas sees as derivative is seen elsewhere in the world as new and as revelatory. And I think what struck me while editing TV's Betty Goes Global anthology with Kim Akas is how this ugly duckling story, which in so many ways continues to peddle the Cinderella myth, has something very important to tell us about the universality of that story, related to the geopolitics of femininity, feminism, and being female in the world. And I will return to that at the end. So if we can go to my next slide, please. Still, I want to ask, why are we so compelled to keep repeating and retelling this story? And, you know, what can we make of this compulsion to retell this story in different territories, to invest in it and to adapt it locally? And the latest Betty is arriving in South Africa with Ubertina Veldhuis, which went into production in 2020. And then we had the Telemundo 2019 reimagining, which resituates the original in New York City with, I'm not even going to begin to try to pronounce it in Spanish just because I'll be embarrassed, but Betty in New York. Now, this was dedicated to the creator, Fernando Gaitan, but this is a bilingual series in English with Spanish subtitles, but also in Spanish with English subtitles. So, you know, that's an extraordinary sort of development. So, you know, here we have Betty arriving in New York almost 20 years later, after its a first arrival in Latin America. And I want to argue that its arrival in America through Telemundo actually might have something to tell us about why Florence Thomas may be a little excised about the representation. However, the different stories, including the original, resells in different markets around the world, and the continued existence of the original, I think, not only has something important to tell us about its significance for global TV beyond Colombia, but also its continued visibility, I want to suggest, bestows privilege and value on the new adaptations appearing in the world, but also it reconfirms the validity of the original at the same time. So to give some context to that observation, let me pull out the telescopic lens for a moment, because much has happened since Betty first appeared in the world in 1999. And before I respond further to Thompson, I want to say a few words about that. Reorientating the television map to consider the latest phase of media globalization has preoccupied contemporary TV studies for the last 2 decades, almost paralleling the Ugly Betty story in the world. So this has been a period marked by further liberalization, more deregulation of TV markets, and it's also been a time profoundly shaped by media convergence and digitalization. With the advent of streaming services, the internet-based distribution of television has disaggregated the entire chain of delivery from providers to the audience. The arrival of asynchronous distribution and non-linear delivery of content has had far-reaching consequences. This has disrupted established industry paradigms, but also challenged the very basis of what classifies television as a traditional broadcast medium, where historically the concept of flow was a foundational principle, you know, aka Raymond Williams, and later theorized by John Ellis. Such changes in the very materiality of the delivery have not only impacted on the availability of content, but also the very materiality of the object. For example, the TV format, which, as Jean Chalabi notes, emerged as the global TV product par excellence. And the fact that Yoso Betty became such a valuable piece of IP or intellectual property says, I think, something very important about not only the relevancy of that story, but also, more importantly, perhaps, how it represents a type of television, the format, whose time has come. So working then across borders in television is nothing new. Still, its global and digital acceleration and the seemingly virtual boundlessness of delivery introduces new questions for theory. For me, this task is about how to theoretically grasp the geopolitical, the geographical trends. Sorry, can you go back? I haven't finished. Sorry. Can you get? Yeah, thank you. Let me start again. For me, this task then is about theoretically grasping the geopolitical and the geographical trends in TV content designed to cross borders, past and present. And more importantly for me, perhaps, what are the implications for a feminist TV criticism? But also, this is what motivated the Betty collection with its very thick description of Ugly Betty in circulation. And how the original scripted format in many ways would help us think and change the way we think about television in the world. And to this end, I'd like to draw down the themes of the edited collection as a way to identify some specific trends in European scholarship, ways of theorizing television, but also of practicing research in the world. So can I have my next slide, please? I think one of the central aims of the book was to understand the visible and the not so perceptible marks of cross-border transnational activities of the local, the national, the regional, and the global, and how all that structures TV content that travels, and certainly a process which had escalated in the noughties, of which Yoso Betty was a key example. So using the Colombian original and its adaptations and remakes, the authors of this anthology sought to make sense of the contemporary dynamics of global media systems, industries, markets, as well as to start identifying new cultural trends, but also ways to challenge the these center periphery thesis that had initially held sway. Such a rhetoric of margins and centers has long shaped how we understand global television in general, but also the histories and cultures of transnational television in particular. With a center peripheral thinking complicit in the production of knowledge about inside and outside, the dominance and the margins, in a binary logic of power involving trading flows and cultural exchange. So this way of thinking then translated post-war globalization theories of the 50s and 60s into, amongst other things, mass communications media theory. And mass communications theory really sort of dominated television studies early on. And with its methodology based on quantitative analysis, there was a sort of a way of sort of defining this one-way, primarily US flow of television across borders. So statistics and longitudinal data tracking trace then older colonial routes from the west to the rest, and based on figures alone, revealed on the surface at least the direction of traffic in television content as yet another gesture of Western trading dominance and cultural imperialism. So what emerges then from the media-cultural imperialism debate is fundamentally a debate about exporting and about trade. It recognizes cross-border distribution of television content through the prism of a political economy, understood primarily in the context of the wider horizons of neoliberalism with its market-orientated philosophy, which favors deregulation, reducing trading barriers, and shrinking the role of the state, i.e. public service television models of television in favor of the market solutions of commercial television solutions. So in many ways, this is the debate that Ugly Betty kind of entered into. And several of our authors, well, most of our authors would challenge this idea. Authors like US TV historian Michelle Hilms, but also, again, the European scholars working often in the UK, interesting enough, like Andrea Esser and Jean Shalaby. And they were kind of making then empirical interventions and theoretical considerations to help us think differently about television content that travels. So for Michelle Hilms then, using Ugly Betty, which was the US version, by the way, she started to reverse this one-way flow thesis. Hilms offered us an interventionist narrative of the visible and the unseen, the unwritten and often unconscious rules governing transnational trading collaborations, those cross-border exchanges and institutional alliances of which she calls network nations. So key to her argument was that alive in the US Ugly Betty then was another narrative which told of contraflows and alternative flows of commerce and creative thinking. And in her thesis, the TV format then embraces the prefix trans at a multiple level. Formats for Michelle Hilms points us to entangled yet also divergent local, regional, global forces, some of which are capable of traversing the limits of specific systems of cultural distribution, as well as challenging those seemingly stable and fixed entities, such as the national broadcaster or centres of cultural production. In his contribution to the study of TV formats, including the late rise of scripted formats, is Jean Shalaby. And Shalaby is interested in this idea, which he's conceptualized as the global value chain. Shalaby goes on to explain the corporate strategies and power relations underlying the global trading system delivered at local levels and also delivering local value. This tightly entwined negotiation of cross-border intersection involves commerce, it involves culture, it involves copyright, charged with geographical distribution and recycling of global formats into locally produced content. And all this is explored in his lovely interview with Jeff Ford at Channel 4. And what they discuss in this article is why the UK's fourth public service broadcaster purchased the US Ugly Betty, but didn't purchase the original Colombian telenovela, and also why the UK decided not to make their own version. Another scholar in the book to use these qualitative methods within her research was Andrea Esser. Like Shalaby, she's a media sociologist, but with her sights firmly trained on production practices and the audience. Like Shalaby, she's interested in those agents facilitating the international movement of TV content and product. And to this end, this is reflected in her contribution into the book with her interviews with a series of TV execs who were involved in the phenomenally successful German adaptation of Yo Betty, which was Werd lieb in Berlin, Falling in Love in Berlin, as a loose translation. So media policy and comparative studies of production and distribution content, patterns of consumption and reception, these are the issues at the center of these interdisciplinary interventions which shape the European perspective, and where we see them drawing the global into local situatedness, not only of local values, but also local and national traditions of scholarship. Combining qualitative and quantitative studies. No, sorry, yes, thank you. Can you go back, please? Thanks. The academic research carried out in Europe often takes place across borders and is often funded through European research grants. And this work then has mobilized, as such, various methods and methodologies from the humanities and social sciences to facilitate new knowledge about the interplay between the national and the international television industries. In many ways, the Colombian telenovela, in the way that it broke through, reversed the trade and stimulated a new debate. And this was partly because of the success of the European adaptations in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Greece, in Germany, where Vertlim in Berlin was an absolute mega hit for Sat1, which was it is the major channel in Germany, but also with the Spanish version, which had been made, surprise, in Italy. Which adds also another layer to the story of cross-border creative and commercial exchange, of what travels and what doesn't, what is possible in one territory and what is not possible in another. So providing frameworks better able to grasp these geographical trends in TV content designed to cross borders, past and present, in our increasingly globalized and digital world remains very much at the center of European television scholarship. Furthermore, I would argue the early work on Ugly Betty has segued into far-reaching studies of co-productions and institutional collaborations, of trading relationships and cultural policies, of how television migration it provides opportunities to think differently about audience metrics and viewer habits, and this work may have left the specificity of Io So Betty behind, but what I want to argue is the structures of thinking remain firmly embedded within our research, which is why I would argue we can't quite leave Io So Betty, Ugly Betty behind. So just to draw down two lessons from this work, the first lesson that we can learn about this is about translation. As a cultural theorist and feminist scholar of transnational television, the challenge of translation shapes my work, and work which also involves cultural mediation. Interdisciplinarity, cross-disciplinary practices are central to the way I research and the way I actually practice transnational television studies, as I'm also a practitioner of the audio-visual essay. And this is also an issue that we might want to discuss later within our discussion. For me, at least, I think translation also involves these acts then of mediation, both discursive and material. Translation is performed across various registers of theory and language, of culture and cultural referencing, of intellectual traditions, and of positionalities. And practicing global TV also reveals processes of translating culture and what that means. This relates in part to translating of institutional thinking and practices, but also of understanding the audiences and actually translating their behaviors and habits and ways of thinking. But also translation relates to translating values and judgments and cultural works, and how popular telenovelas from Latin America in cross-border circulation become translated as very important television content, because the original scripted content matters to those who matter within culture, those like critics and journalists, TV buyers and schedulers. And liking this kind of television becomes a marker of taste. And in the words of Bourdieu, it kind of classifies them as cultural elites. Furthermore, it's important to acknowledge, I think, our positionality as scholars and as researchers of television in the world, and our role as translators and interpreters of culture. And this is something I think we could pick up on in our discussion. And finally here, there's the issue of, for me, of decolonization. In many ways, the Colombian telenovela in the world asks us to think again, in the way that this series speaks back to us, it allows us elsewhere in the world to look again. Of course, with adaptation, there are dangers of appropriation and also misappropriation. But the ambition of transnational television studies is in many ways to decipher the global, its scales, its spaces, its subjects. It's about relocating debate and decolonizing the very structures of our thinking to introduce new ways of complexity and ambiguity in the study of television in the world. So if I could go to my final slide, please. I'd like to just finish then with my response to Thomas. For while I hear what she's saying, I'm also intrigued by her cultural cringe. The cultural cringe has been noted by several of my European colleagues, in particular Pierre Maybrit Jansen, and who works in Denmark, and Marian McCutcheons, who is based in Australia, and they, through their collaborative work, have been looking at how the Nordic noir heroine has travelled around the world and how she's found fans in the most unlikely of places. And one thing they noticed in their research is that why the Nordic noir heroine looked so progressive, so far from home, was partly at the expense of domestic content, or as Jansen and McCutcheon put it, a worrying sense of the inferiority of one's own culture. And so I want to kind of finish with some thoughts on the implications then for female representational geopolitics and feminism in the world, because I can hear that worrying sense of inferiority of one's culture in the sentiments expressed by Florence Thomas. So the latest phase of globalization then, what we've seen over the last decade or so with its ideological neoliberalism and transcultural flows, has in many ways re-energized feminist debates. One way in which feminist scholars from different cultural horizons have tackled this critical urgency is to address how modes of power inscribe gender and identity into local material formations, while remaining at the same time entangled within transnational cross-border flows of culture and global capital. This conceptual remapping then guides my feminist interventions into transnational television studies, but also this ambition to identify local representational materialities within the adaptation guided the work of much of the feminist scholarship within the Betty anthology. Attention was thus paid to how, under the forces of cultural globalization, the rewriting of woman as an image, as a representational discourse, but also women, real material subjects, call then for innovative ways to reconsider the relationship between the feminine, female, woman, and power and bodies of knowledge, and how this is shaped both theoretically, but also with regards to how that materializes within particular television production cultures around the world. So what interests me here then is how different categories of female bodies, identities, and subjectivities are being reproduced, repositioned, and reimagined under transnational conditions inside national television cultures. Contemporary flows involving the migration of content, creativity, know-how, and media technologies have clearly disrupted the old logic of television, and they have transformed into new business initiatives, new trading routes and markets, but also new forms and formats designed to travel. The politics, I would argue, of the female, her body, her agency and subjectivity, her identity and visibility is caught in the trading and cultural crossfire. This politics is entangled in transnationally networked but nationally located regional media ecologies and the materiality of specific representational geopolitics. Such issues of female visibility are no longer contained within national borders and local domains, but instead tumble into the world, often in permeable, messy and ambiguous ways, often to take a different kind of material existence when seen through a transnational frame. So in response to Thomas, I ask how fit for purpose, in many ways, liberal feminism as a theoretical travelling partner is. Because, you know, this is what's at the heart of her response, a kind of very liberal feminist response. Because disclosing the unwritten and often unconscious rules structuring the very epistemology of feminism, scaled up in the world, has proved, I think, a vital contribution of feminist scholarship, including the work of Eleanor Scholhar and Gairati Spivak. Both have patrolled the very unstable borderlands where feminist theory encounters anti-colonial thinking and where the politics of culture coincides with a pervasiveness of imperial patriarchal reason that still lingers in the world. So revealed then in the global scaling up of core values like female emancipation, women's rights, gender equality, is then a kind of first world feminism. But also exposed is yet another gesture of kind of Western culture as imperialism, or as Spivak puts it, another way of colonized and colonial thinking. So as a response to this question for transnational television feminism, I do think we must remain alert to the numerous patriarchies located in multiple settings around the world and how these formations take on distinct forms, occur in very discrete ways and in different places and at different times. And here I'm drawn to what Inderpol Groval and Karen Kaplan have advocated in what they call scattered hegemonies, when they say, quote, we need to articulate the relationship of gender to scattered hegemonies, such as global economic structures, patriarchal nationalisms, authentic forms of tradition, local structures of domination, and legal judicial oppressions on multiple levels. Indeed, I find this concept of scattered hegemonies compelling for a feminist studies of transnational television cultures, and I argue that we should add it to our critical arsenal to help mystify the material conditions defining the situatedness of female bodies, identities and subjectivities involved in trading TV formats and producing and acting in the dramas, but also how the female as image materializes in a diverse range of representational practices subject to very different patriarchal configurations dotted around the world. We need then theory better able to account for all these differences, these discontinuities and discrepancies, but also a theory sensitive enough to hear, in the words of Trin Min Ha, nearby. So for while Thompson, I think, finds these representations cringing, the gender politics has translated into cultures around the world to undertake some very important cultural work, such as in Russia and the Czech Republic, where the adaptations were used to negotiate the shifts in living from under communism to overcoming class, economic and social conflicts in post-Soviet societies. In India, the Betty version of Jassi emerged as a very careful and artful manipulation of Indian womanhood at a very specific time in the sort of gender political history of that country. So aspiration and social mobility, private desires, global ambitions, traveling tales and local adaptations, it's in and through the central heroine and played across various bodies that the paradoxical discourses of our continued age of trouble emancipation emerges in the world. And bound, I think, for better or for worse, that debate, in that debate is why unruly eyebrows, heavy stainless steel braces, unkempt hair, thick spectacles remains the ubiquitous signifier of female ugliness the world over. And with that, I thank you for listening, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Janet. It has been a very interesting approach, and I think you've thrown a lot of questions and concerns regarding Betty and global TV and transnational TV. I would like to start throwing this question to you. I will try to do a little bit of a devil's advocate here. So yeah, when you were talking, I loved the way you described Florence Thomas's approach, like a cultural cringe, and I can see where you come from. But then I was asking myself, like sometimes, many times, when I've talked with people, especially from first world countries, about Betty and Betty phenomenon and all that, sometimes you feel and you get the sense that audience can interpret Betty as some kind of caricature, and something real exaggerated, that they're not real characters and they are not real situations. So there I can see some point from Florence Thomas, like, okay, this is not a caricature in Colombia, in terms of there are a lot of as you were saying as well, there are a lot of patriarchal still trends and behaviors in society. So how would you were mentioning the example of India, which is a very interesting example, but I think there's a debate there as well as how first world cultures and countries and societies read this content, read Betty, and the social characteristics and features we still have in Colombia. I don't know if it makes sense. You see where I'm coming from.
I do see where you're coming from. I think the first thing I would say is one thing that occurs to me with Betty, and I wondered if this was part of Florence Thomas's pain about it. It's something I felt with Sex and the City. Is that representations of women that really capture the zeitgeist come along quite rarely, strangely. I mean, I know you think it happens, but as an observer of it, it doesn't. And suddenly these representations bear a huge burden of responsibility in their representation, to really carry a debate. And so I think that there's something there that these figures become a kind of crucible for fierce negotiation, of which there can be a lot of resistance. And I've experienced this within my own career, sort of being told, why am I talking about Sex and the City, which is just this ghastly representation of 4 women who are completely utterly self-indulged and so forth. And I hear that in how Thompson is talking about Betty. And I think it's also, and so that issue is about, well, what's that cultural work doing? Just because you don't like it doesn't mean say, it's obviously doing something, because lots of people, millions of people are tuning in. And this was something that really struck me about the response, was that I sort of felt with Thompson's response is it sort of recognized that Betty had become this belonging to the world now. And what I loved about the response is that there was a reclamation for what that meant.
You mean the response from Jorge Enrique Abello, the actor? Yeah,
the actor, to reclaim it for Colombia. Saying, don't forget what this representation did in 1999 to 2001 and why it was successful. And I not only love the reclamation from this, Betty, from this sort of global phenomenon to the local again, but it also resituated in what were the kind of forces that were going on at the time, which made it really, it was a strike a chord. And and I was really sort of taken by how, particularly because the curator's no longer here to make the defense. I think that's also another issue about time and temporalities, and the person who created this is no longer here, and there was this moment that that we're not going to lose that. We're not going to lose that moment of creative intent, and the gender politics which was which was within the original. My response, sorry, it's a bit multi-layered there. So it's about the issue about the global and what it means globally, and then what it means specifically. But also there's a temporal question there about, don't forget what this meant at the time. You know, we may look at it now and go, gosh, it's derivative, gosh, it's stereotypical. But boy, oh boy, did it do some important heavy lifting. And often the heavy lifting is often done through some kind of odd stereotypes. And we can see that throughout. I mean, you can see that through Dynasty in Dallas, you know, that the people were absolutely drawn to, you know, Sue Ellen Ewing in Dallas and, you know, Alexis Carrington in Dynasty. Obviously, hideous characters in many ways. But you know, it's also needing that sort of sense to listen, you know, nearby, and not sort of impose your sort of, I don't know, liberal feminist view on it. Because,
I understand.
you know,
And by the way, I love how you were saying, like, yeah, but if we want to talk about liberal feminism, then we're talking as well about a first world agenda, you know. Yeah. So that was really interesting. And also because I was thinking, I've always thought Betty, I don't know if you agree on this, but I've always thought Betty, more than a telenovela, it's a comedy. And that's and humor there, it's a key and crucial element, you know, because we know comedy, it can fall, you know, into exactly stereotypes, irony, sarcasm, caricature, and that also brings a whole new discussion. I don't know if you see it the same way.
Absolutely, I completely agree with you. And also, you know, because it's a comedy, or it's a telenovela, or it's a melodrama, you know, these are sort of forms that, again, you know, we often don't take very seriously, but actually they do huge cultural work. And you know, it was funny, I was interviewed quite recently for an article on The Sopranos. And you know how, you know, valorized.
Well, there you have stereotypes, you know.
Exactly. But again, it feeds in because it's part of the kind of gangster mythology. You know, how it's lived in the American cultural imagination has endured in a way that, say, Sex and the City has not. And what I thought was really interesting in the debate you're sharing with me was that a similar process was going on. You know, that you know, if Betty had been a gangster and a man, you know, would she have endured a little bit more? You know, because I do think we need, as scholars, to, you know, check our language of privilege when we're kind of talking about these issues. But also when we talk about comedy, just going back to I suppose something that I was saying earlier about the kind of comparativeness, that I think it's important to have these cross-border discussions. So, you know, when I'm talking about comedy, it might not quite be the same as what you're talking about comedy, but in those in-between spaces, I think, you know, this is where we can begin to start to tease out that specificity of, you know, why things travel, why things don't, and how you know, certain cultures are reacting, and how so certain people within, you know, a particular culture is reacting to the same thing we're looking at as well.
Yeah, I agree. And because another thing, now that you were mentioning, for example, Dallas, Sex and the City, The Sopranos, then I was thinking as well, like, okay, but here, and you were talking about Schiller, media imperialism, cultural imperialism. So those are products that have arrived to our cultures and to our countries. And some of them were, in the 80s, everything was dubbed. Then subtitles became more usual. Well, especially on cable television, national open television still works with dubbed versions. But then I was thinking as well, like, okay, but the way Betty has traveled is, as you were saying, through adaptations. And then as you also very cleverly stated, then it comes the issue of appropriation and sometimes misappropriation. So don't you think that there's a little bit of a gap there, still a bit of a gap there, because we receive the versions from First World, but then Betty had to travel being adapted and with national characters and national scenarios and national stories. How do you see that?
That's a really good question. I think my answer is, how did it travel? I mean, I think what's very interesting is that it arrived in America via the Mexican version, actually, because Hayek had found it, and because of the connections with.
And it's interesting, the geopolitical map there. It's very interesting.
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. And so that's really interesting. So and so that anyway, so that route to America meant that certain things got added to the format. So when the Chinese purchased Ugly Betty, they didn't purchase the original Colombian, they purchased Mexican, because why?
Crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah. And how they could then use the format within the to make the show in terms of product placements and the kind of commercialization that was going on within China. Whereas what's really interesting is you can see that the Colombian original went into Eastern Europe, it went into Russia, it went into India. So it's very interesting to see nations which are sort of in a similar sort of position, geopolitically, economically,
socially.
Yeah, exactly. So telenovelas have never done well in the UK, because that's not our story. However, telenovelas have done extraordinarily well in Russia, I mean, interesting enough, I mean, what was so interesting about Yo Soy Betty was that it did so well in India, which it never done before. But again, talk about sort of cometh the hour, cometh the show, and it is a moment when the markets are opening up in a very different way. So I think what's so interesting about the Betty story is it can tell us so much about what was going on. And still, that's why the text is still with us. That's why it's still on Netflix, because it's still got something very important to tell us culturally, but also in terms of how that show travels. As a scripted format, what it's telling us about how we trade television, how we distribute it, how it's syndicated, and also the kind of different routes. This isn't west to the rest. This is a show coming out of Latin America, and I think it's very interesting to sort of see how the telenovela form, which is a transnational form. I don't need to tell you; you're an expert. But how that it then is speaking back to European cultures, and particularly what happens in Spain, because they didn't make it in Spain. They made the show in Italy. And Italy never had its own version. So even then, there's this wonderful kind of push-pull, but there's this nuanced, subtle, discussion that's going on about these new global forces.
I agree, and I don't know, but if you're aware, but right now in Colombia we have a very weird phenomenon with Turkish telenovelas.
No, they're huge.
Yeah, they're huge, and it's crazy because whenever you watch them, you can see exactly the same melodrama structure that we've specialized in here in Latin America. But then these Turkish making these soap operas or telenovelas, and then we're bringing them back, and we listen to these actors speaking Spanish, but Mexican dubbed, because it's not a Colombian accent but Mexican accent, and it's like, okay, what's going on here? So I don't know if you were aware of that, because I find that fascinating.
Yeah,
it's part of this whole landscape, of transnational and
Yeah, I mean, Turkey has exploded as a region recently, and there was a fantastic new book that's just come out. So who's straining over to look at her bookshelf on the phenomena. Interesting enough, you can't see them here in the UK. I mean, given that BBC4 has really kind of pioneered the Nordic noir, the Scandi dramas, these Turkish melodramas have yet to come here. I mean, you can see them sometimes on Netflix, but once again, it also shows that you have this sort of sense within the scholarship that the US and the UK sort of dominated, but I think what we're seeing is this absolute explosion of the centers of power, and how there are other flows going on which completely bypass these, US, UK
center.
Yeah, these centers. I mean, they're only centers, I mean, because of the flow of television, because I mean that was
and the economic strength as well, and the production strength. They have a muscle that no other country has,
Absolutely. And I mean, it's always when I was interviewing somebody around the bridge, that it's seen as that Nordic noir, that the Germans financed it, but the BBC gave it the window on the world. So there's all that kind of soft power as well. But I think it's really interesting to sort of see the influence of telenovelas on Turkey, and how Turkey then, as its industry has kind of matured, has absorbed those and is now speaking back.
And now those Turkish main characters are become like idols here, like the new galanes. That's how we call it, the galan. Jorge Enrique Abello would be the galan of Betty La Fea, the handsome main protagonist, and they're here. It has become like massive, these soap operas, and it's crazy. And also it has happened with South Korea as well.
Yeah, I was going to, you're ahead of me, because I was going to ask you, how is the kind of East Asia phenomena that how does that affect
here because it's still on like cable television, so like Netflix and platforms. But like for example, my students, I know many of them watch all these South Korean and even younger. Like I've got a cousin who's like 14 years old now, and she was crazy about these South Korean soap operas as well, and all of her friends were talking about that, and it was part of the conversations at school. But again, when you watch them, you see, well, we invented this back in the 80s. It's crazy. So but I think also, and that would be another conversation, but the whole exotic thing of either Turkish characters or South Korean characters, I think there's an aura there on this kind of content. So I think these new generations may find boring just watching the Colombian soap opera, but there's something exotic and fascinating about this content. But that would be a whole new conversation.
No, I mean, but it's a fascinating conversation. I'm really fascinated about what you're saying there about how. So what you're suggesting is that telenovela influenced Korea, because that was one of the interesting sort of discourses around Hallyu is how that spoke back to its center, i.e. Japan. And how Autumn Sonata just became is it Winter Sonata, not Autumn Sonata? Winter Sonata just became hugely popular in Japan, and then just sort of created this counterwave. So because again, this is really interesting to hear. So
the circle,
and telenovelas and that.
Because whenever you watch them, you can see the structure, the traditional classic telenovela structure is exactly the same. Yeah. So it would be interesting to find out how was the whole journey and the path built. But it's fascinating. But then the content, you watch it and it's like, okay, this is a 1980s telenovela, that I watched when I was growing up, when I was a teenager. Anyway, Janet, we're running out of time. We could stay here forever, but we're both fascinated by this subject and this topic. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. It was a really, really interesting talk, and I hope to see you soon.
I hope to see you soon. Thank you so much as well. It's been absolutely fantastic for me too.
Okay, thank you. Gracias a todos por asistir. Gracias, Anthony.
We thank our guests, Dr. Janet Maccabi and Professor Juan Pablo Osman, for their special participation, and all attendees for joining us in this session of Cátedra Europa. We invite you to continue supporting the education of talented students through our scholarship fundraising campaign, Más Becas, by clicking on the donation button on the homepage of Cátedra Europa. We also encourage you to stay connected to the rest of Cátedra Europa events. Thank you.
Bye.
Thanks.